They say the worst day of your life rarely starts with a warning. There is no ominous soundtrack playing in the background, no sudden drop in the barometric pressure to tell you that the life you've painstakingly built is about to be violently dismantled. My personal tragedy began on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon, bathed in the golden, deceitful sunlight of a California autumn. Within the span of a few short hours, the sacred vows I took, the future I had meticulously planned, and the woman I loved would all be reduced to absolute ashes. But the universe has an incredibly ironic, deeply poetic sense of humor. Because while I was walking blindly into the absolute darkest, most devastating moment of my existence, I had absolutely no idea that the universe was simply clearing the board. It was tearing down my broken foundation to make room for a staggering, multi-million-dollar miracle and a breathtaking love story I didn't even know I was ready for. But before you can truly understand the spectacular high of my new reality, you have to understand the agonizing low of the day it all began. The heavy commercial tires of the Boeing 737 hit the tarmac at Sacramento International Airport with a loud, jarring thud, violently shaking me out of a restless, uncomfortable sleep. I was a senior corporate accountant, a numbers guy who lived for predictable spreadsheets, quiet offices, and the comforting, grounded routine of my suburban life. I absolutely loathed business travel. I hated the recycled air, the cramped seats, the overpriced airport coffee, and the sterile, lonely feeling of corporate hotel rooms. Unfortunately, my managing director despised traveling even more than I did, which meant that once every quarter, I was the sacrificial lamb sent down to our San Diego branch to audit their quarterly financials. As the plane slowly taxied toward the gate, the cabin erupted into the familiar, chaotic chorus of 100 seatbelts unclicking and overhead bins snapping open. I didn't rush to stand up. I simply leaned my head against the cool acrylic of the window, let out a massive, soul-clearing sigh of relief, and pulled my cell phone from the inside pocket of my blazer. I turned off airplane mode and immediately clicked on the contact picture I had pinned to my favorites. It was a photo of my wife, Jessica. She was laughing, her bright blonde hair blowing across her face, holding a glass of wine on our back patio. We had been married for 4 years, and to me, she was the absolute center of gravity in my world. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Hey, honey," I said cheerfully, keeping my voice low as the passengers around me began to shuffle into the narrow aisle. "I survived. The plane just touched down." "Oh, hey," Jessica answered. Her voice was slightly breathy, distracted, like she was in the middle of a strenuous workout or frantically rushing to clean the house. "You're back already. I thought your flight didn't land until 5. "I managed to catch an earlier standby flight," I explained, smiling as I grabbed my heavy leather duffel bag from beneath the seat in front of me. "I wrapped up the audits early, and I just couldn't stand being away from you and the house for another second. I'm going to grab my car from the economy lot now. I should be pulling into the driveway in about an hour." "Okay, great," she said. It was a short, clipped response entirely devoid of the warmth I had been hoping for. "I'm just finishing up some chores around the house. I'll see you when you get here. Love you." "Love you too, Jess. Bye." I ended the call, entirely oblivious to the subtle, frantic panic hiding just beneath the surface of her voice. To my trusting ears, she was just my hardworking, dedicated wife, probably elbow-deep in laundry or organizing her art supplies. Walking through the terminal, the exhaustion of the 3-day trip began to melt away, replaced by a light, buoyant anticipation. I bypassed baggage claim, walked out into the bright, warm California air, and found my sedan in the massive parking structure. I threw my bags into the passenger seat, cranked up the air conditioning, and merged onto Interstate 80, heading east toward our quiet, idyllic neighborhood in Fair Oaks. As the miles rolled by, a classic rock station playing softly in the background, my mind drifted to our future. I was tired, yes, but it was a purposeful exhaustion. I was working these grueling 60-hour weeks, taking these miserable business trips, and aggressively climbing the corporate ladder for one specific reason. I wanted to be a father. Jessica had a deep passion for graphic design, and for the last 2 years, I had been completely funding our lifestyle so she could quit her stressful corporate job and build her own freelance art business from home. She had asked for time to get her business off the ground before we started trying for a baby, and I had happily agreed. I wanted to give her the world. I believed that by carrying the financial burden now, I was paving the way for her to be a comfortable, stress-free, stay-at-home mother in the beautiful house we had bought together. I was smiling as I took my exit, cruising down the familiar, tree-lined streets of our suburban neighborhood. I was so incredibly ready to walk through my front door, drop my bags, and pull my wife into a massive hug. I was completely, blissfully blind to the fact that the life I was driving back to had already been destroyed. The drive from Sacramento International Airport to the leafy, idyllic enclave of Fair Oaks usually took about 40 minutes, depending on the unforgiving California traffic. But on that particular Tuesday afternoon, the eastbound lanes of Interstate 80 were miraculously clear. I set the cruise control to a comfortable 70 miles per hour, rolled down the driver's side window just enough to let a stream of crisp, late afternoon air circulate through the cabin, and let out a long, slow breath. The radio was turned down low, softly playing a familiar, comforting Fleetwood Mac track. With every mile marker that blurred past my window, the sterile, fluorescent nightmare of the San Diego corporate audits seemed to wash away, dissolving into the warm, golden-hour light that was beginning to bathe the Sacramento Valley. As I drove, my mind inevitably drifted, as it always did, to the woman waiting for me at the end of my commute. To understand the absolute, unmitigated devastation of what was about to happen to me, you have to understand the profound depth of my devotion to Jessica. We were, by all outward appearances, the classic case of opposites attracting. I was a senior corporate accountant. My entire brain was wired in columns and rows, in predictable margins and calculated risk. My world was black and white, governed by the rigid, unyielding laws of mathematics and tax code. Jessica, on the other hand, was entirely rendered in vivid, chaotic color. She was a fiercely creative, free-spirited artist with a degree in graphic design and a mind that operated on pure, unfiltered intuition. When we met 5 years ago at a mutual friend's dinner party, she had essentially walked into my quiet, highly organized life and turned all the lights on. She brought a spontaneous, breathtaking joy into my world that I hadn't even realized I was starved for. I loved her with a quiet, fierce intensity that defied all logic. She was the center of my gravity, the single fixed point around which my entire universe revolved. But a few years into our marriage, the harsh realities of the corporate world had begun to crush her vibrant spirit. She was working 60 hours a week at a high-pressure, incredibly toxic downtown marketing firm. I watched her come home night after night, her eyes red-rimmed from crying in her car, entirely drained of the brilliant creative energy that made her who she was. The corporate grind was extinguishing her light, and as her husband, I simply couldn't stand by and watch it happen. I remember the exact night everything changed. We were sitting on the floor of our living room, eating takeout, and she had just broken down over another manufactured crisis caused by her demanding boss. I had reached out, taken her hands in mine, and told her to quit. I told her to walk into her office the very next morning and hand in her notice. I promised her that I would carry the weight. I was already doing well at the accounting firm, but I told her I would take on extra clients, work the weekends, and volunteer for the grueling out-of-town quarterly audits that the other senior partners despised. I told her I would build a financial fortress around us so that she could stay home, launch her own freelance art and design business, and finally breathe again. And that is exactly what I did. The financial sacrifice was immense. Our sprawling, 4-bedroom ranch-style home in Fair Oaks was beautiful, but the mortgage was substantial. To seamlessly absorb the loss of her salary, I had essentially sold my soul to the firm. For the last 2 years, I had worked myself to the bone. I missed weekend barbecues with my friends, I gave up my golf club membership, and I spent countless lonely nights in sterile hotel rooms in San Diego and Los Angeles, poring over mind-numbing spreadsheets until my vision blurred. But I never resented a single second of it. I didn't view it as a burden. I viewed it as the ultimate investment in our future. I had even converted the largest spare bedroom on the second floor into a custom, sunlit art studio for her. I spent 2 solid weekends tearing up the carpet, installing hardwood floors that would be easy to clean when she inevitably spilled paint, and buying her top-of-the-line digital design tablets. Seeing her face light up the morning I revealed the studio to her was worth every single missed hour of sleep. I thought I was being the ultimate provider. I thought I was protecting my wife. But my willingness to sacrifice wasn't just about making Jessica happy in the present. It was fundamentally tied to a much deeper, more profound dream I held for our future. I wanted to be a father. It was an ache that had been growing steadily in my chest since I turned 30. I am a pragmatic, logical man, but whenever I thought about having a child with Jessica, I became hopelessly sentimental. I wanted to teach a kid how to ride a bicycle in the cul-de-sac. I wanted to sit in the bleachers at Little League baseball games. I wanted a little girl with Jessica's bright blonde hair and infectious, crinkling smile, or a little boy who would run through the backyard sprinklers on hot July afternoons. Directly down the hall from Jessica's custom art studio was the fourth bedroom of our house. It was currently empty, save for a few boxes of out-of-season clothes, but in my mind it was already painted a soft pastel color. In my mind there was already a crib sitting in the corner. When I had initially brought up the idea of starting our family, Jessica had been hesitant. She told me that she wanted to be a mother, but she was terrified of losing her newfound creative momentum. She asked me for a little more time. "Just let me get the freelance business totally stable, Ethan," she had pleaded, resting her head against my chest one night. "I want to establish my client base so that when the baby comes, I can just seamlessly transition into being a work-from-home mom. Give me another year to build my portfolio, please." Because I loved her, and because I wanted her to feel completely secure, I had agreed. I pushed my own deep, biological yearning down and focused entirely on providing the runway she needed to launch her dreams. Every overtime hour I billed, every lonely flight I boarded, and every stressful corporate meeting I endured was fueled by the singular, beautiful vision of that empty fourth bedroom finally being filled with the sound of our child. I was building our kingdom. I had absolutely no idea that I was simply financing my own destruction. I turned off the interstate and merged onto the familiar, winding local roads that led into Fair Oaks. The dense canopy of ancient oak trees arched over the street, casting long, dancing shadows across the hood of my car. I drove past the local elementary school, past the neighborhood park where a few kids were still kicking a soccer ball around in the fading light, and turned onto our quiet cul-de-sac. My chest fluttered with a light, warm anticipation. I was so incredibly ready to be home. I couldn't wait to drop my heavy leather duffel bag on the floor, kick off my stiff dress shoes, and walk into her studio. I imagined her sitting at her desk, a smudge of charcoal on her cheek, turning around and lighting up with surprise when she realized I was home a full day early. I wanted to wrap my arms around her waist, bury my face in her neck, and tell her that the San Diego audits were finally finished for the quarter. I pulled my sedan up to the edge of my driveway, the tires crunching softly against the concrete. The house looked perfectly peaceful, bathed in the soft, amber glow of the setting sun. The front curtains were drawn, and Jessica's compact SUV was parked neatly on the far side of the driveway. I smiled, completely exhausted but profoundly happy, and reached up to press the button on my sun visor to open the garage door. I pressed it once. Nothing happened. I frowned, pressing it a second time, holding it down harder. The heavy, insulated aluminum garage door remained completely, stubbornly shut. I didn't hear the familiar mechanical groan of the chain drive. I tapped the button a third time, but the system was entirely dead. It was a microscopic, trivial mechanical failure. A blown fuse, a misaligned sensor, or a dead battery in the clicker. In the grand scheme of the universe, a broken garage door opener is nothing more than a minor suburban inconvenience. But as I put my car into park right there in the driveway and reached over to grab my duffel bag, I didn't know that this tiny, insignificant mechanical glitch was the hinge upon which my entire destiny was about to turn. Because the garage door failed, I couldn't pull my car inside. Because the garage door failed, the loud, rumbling motor didn't echo through the walls of the house to announce my early arrival. Because the garage door failed, I was forced to walk up to the front porch, slide my key into the deadbolt, and enter my own home in absolute terrifying silence. The heavy insulated aluminum of the garage door remained completely, stubbornly shut. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan for a few moments, staring at the white panels, waiting for the familiar mechanical groan of the chain drive. It never came. It was a microscopic, trivial mechanical failure. A blown fuse, a misaligned laser sensor, or perhaps just a dead battery in the visor remote. In the grand, sweeping scheme of the universe, a broken garage door opener is nothing more than a minor suburban inconvenience. But as I put my car into park right there in the concrete driveway and reached over to grab my leather duffel bag, I had absolutely no idea that this tiny, insignificant mechanical glitch was the hinge upon which my entire destiny was about to turn. Because the garage door failed, I couldn't pull my car inside. Because the garage door failed, the loud, rumbling motor didn't echo through the walls of the house to announce my early arrival. It didn't serve as the 30-second warning siren it usually was. Instead, it forced me to walk up the brick pathway to the front porch, slide my key into the brass deadbolt, and enter my own home in absolute, terrifying silence. The key slid into the lock with a soft, metallic click. I turned the knob, pushed the heavy oak door open, and stepped into the foyer. The house was wrapped in a thick, unnatural stillness. The late afternoon sun was slanting heavily through the plantation shutters, casting long, barred shadows across the living room rug. I gently closed the front door behind me, making sure the latch caught without a sound so I wouldn't startle Jessica. I lowered my leather duffel bag to the hardwood floor, easing it down carefully so the metal buckles wouldn't clatter. The air conditioning was humming faintly, blowing a cool breeze across my face. But underneath the sterile, familiar scent of Freon and Jessica's vanilla wax warmers, there was something else in the air. It was a heavy, musky, unfamiliar scent. Cologne, cedar, leather, and bergamot. It was a distinct, expensive fragrance, and it was entirely foreign to our household. I didn't wear cologne. I wore a generic, unscented drugstore deodorant. I stepped out of my stiff dress shoes, leaving them neatly by the welcome mat, and walked in my socks toward the kitchen to put my keys down. My accountant brain, a brain permanently hardwired to recognize anomalies, to balance ledgers, and to find errors in the data, began to quietly, methodically sound an alarm. I walked under the arched entryway into the kitchen, expecting to see Jessica's laptop open on the marble island, or perhaps some watercolor brushes soaking in a mug in the sink. I expected the cheerful, messy signs of her budding freelance business. Instead, the kitchen looked like the aftermath of an intimate, highly deliberate celebration. Two long-stemmed crystal wine glasses sat near the edge of the island, their insides stained with the dark, heavy residue of Cabernet. Resting next to them was a wooden charcuterie board, half-eaten, alongside an uncorked bottle of wine. I stared at the dark green glass of the bottle, and a cold, prickly sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I recognized that label immediately. It was a $300 vintage we had purchased on a trip to Napa Valley. It was the bottle Jessica and I had explicitly agreed to save for our 5-year wedding anniversary. My heart, which had been beating with light, eager anticipation just 3 minutes ago, suddenly dropped into my stomach like a lead weight. Who is here? I thought, my mind racing to force the chaotic visual data into a logical spreadsheet. A client. No, she doesn't host clients at the house. Her sister. No, the cologne. I turned my gaze toward the adjacent dining room. Draped casually over the back of one of our upholstered dining chairs was a sleek black leather motorcycle jacket. Resting on the polished mahogany table beside it was a heavy, matte black men's chronograph watch and a set of keys attached to a silver Mercedes fob. The silence of the house suddenly wasn't absolute anymore. Now that I was standing perfectly still in the center of the kitchen, holding my breath, the blood roaring in my ears, I could hear it. It was coming from the second floor, specifically from the end of the hallway, from our master bedroom. It was a rhythmic, muffled thudding sound accompanied by a low, breathless laugh. It was a laugh I knew intimately. It was the soft, melodic sound Jessica made when she was completely, utterly lost in a moment of passion. It was a sound that belonged exclusively to me. Only I was standing in the kitchen, paralyzed by the sheer, suffocating gravity of what my senses were telling me. Denial is a powerful, blinding, almost narcotic force. My brain screamed at me to turn around. It begged me to pick up my duffel bag, walk back out the front door, and loudly ring the doorbell. It desperately wanted to give her a chance to hide the evidence, to scramble into her clothes, to preserve the flawless illusion of our marriage. It wanted to save the imaginary pastel-yellow nursery upstairs. But the truth is a gravitational pull, and I am a man who requires the raw data, no matter how profoundly it destroys me. I could not stop my feet from moving. I left my keys on the counter, walked out of the kitchen, and approached the staircase. There were 14 wooden steps leading up to the second floor. I had sanded and refinished every single one of them myself 2 summers ago to save us money. Now, as I placed my stockinged foot on the first tread, the wood felt strangely alien beneath my feet. Every step I took felt like I was moving through thick, freezing molasses. I counted them in my head to maintain my grip on reality. 1, 2, 3. By the time I reached the 7th step, my hands were trembling so violently I had to press them flat against my thighs to keep from shaking. I reached the 2nd floor landing. The air up here felt thick, suffocating, entirely devoid of oxygen. To my right was the beautiful, custom-built art studio I had spent thousands of dollars and weeks of my life creating for her. The door was wide open, the expensive digital drawing tablet sitting completely dark and untouched on the desk. To my left was the empty 4th bedroom, the room where our future child was supposed to sleep, the entire reason I had been flying to San Diego and working 60-hour weeks. And straight ahead at the very end of the hall was the master bedroom. The heavy white door was cracked open about 3 inches. The sounds were unmistakable now. There was no ambiguity left to hide behind. I could hear the frantic, chaotic rustle of the expensive Egyptian cotton sheets I had bought her for Christmas. I could hear the heavy, ragged breathing of a man who was not me, and I could hear the breathless, impassioned moans of my wife, echoing down the hallway and acting as a sledgehammer against the foundation of my life. My vision narrowed into a dark, pulsing tunnel. I took one step forward, then another. I was a dead man walking to his own execution, willingly carrying the rope. I stopped just outside the cracked door. The narrow, vertical slice of the opening offered a harsh, cinematic view of the room. The golden hour sunlight was pouring through the bedroom window, illuminating the foot of our bed. Lying on the plush rug discarded carelessly on the floor was a pair of unfamiliar, dark denim men's jeans, tangled intimately with Jessica's delicate white lace underwear. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I didn't kick the door off its hinges like a furious husband in a movie. I simply reached out with a trembling, icy hand, placed my palm flat against the painted wood, and pushed the door open. It swung inward on silent hinges. I stood frozen in the doorway, bearing witness to the absolute violent destruction of my universe. Jessica was in our bed, her bright blonde hair spread wildly across the pillows, her eyes closed in pure, unadulterated ecstasy, her hands gripping the headboard we had picked out together. Hovering over her, entirely consumed by the act, was a man I didn't recognize, a man with broad shoulders, deeply tanned skin, and dark hair. He was in my house. He was in my bed. He was holding the woman I loved, the woman I was sacrificing my sanity to support, the woman I wanted to be the mother of my children. The future I had meticulously planned, the kingdom I had built with my blood, sweat, and endless overtime hours, instantly collapsed into a pile of worthless, burning ash. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, and so intensely disrespectful that it physically knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. I was a ghost haunting the ruins of a life that no longer belonged to me. Time is a fragile, subjective construct. In the span of a single, agonizing heartbeat, the seconds can stretch into hours, freezing a singular image into your retinas with the permanence of a scar. Standing in the doorway of my master bedroom, my hand still resting flat against the painted wood of the door I had just pushed open, time stopped entirely. The world outside my house, the suburban street, the kids playing soccer in the park, the golden California sun sinking toward the horizon, ceased to exist. My entire universe shrank to the dimensions of this room, and the horrifying, undeniable reality playing out on the mattress I had purchased with my wife just 3 years ago. For a moment, neither of them noticed me. They were too entirely consumed by each other, completely insulated by their arrogant assumption that they had the house to themselves until the evening. The silence of my entry had been a perfect, fatal trap. I stood there, a ghost in my own home, and watched the life I knew end. The man's back was to me, his broad, tanned shoulders moving rhythmically, but Jessica was facing the door. Her head was thrown back against the pillows, her eyes tightly shut, her face flushed. I watched her lips part as she let out another soft, breathless sound. And then, as if some primal, subconscious instinct suddenly alerted her to the presence of a predator in the room, her eyes fluttered open. Her gaze drifted lazily toward the doorway, still clouded with passion. The absolute, instantaneous transformation of her face is something that will haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. I watched the ecstasy drain from her features in a violent, sickening rush, replaced instantly by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers, the whites stark and glowing in the dimming light of the room. The breath caught in her throat, choking off whatever sound she was about to make. Her jaw dropped open in a silent, horrified scream. "Ethan!" She gasped, her voice cracking, sounding like a physical tearing of vocal cords. The man froze instantly. The heavy, musky scent of his expensive cedar and bergamot cologne, mixed with the vanilla wax warmers Jessica loved so much, suddenly made me intensely, violently nauseous. The man scrambled off her as if he had just been electrocuted. He rolled awkwardly to the far side of the bed, dragging the expensive Egyptian cotton sheets with him in a desperate attempt to cover himself. Jessica scrambled backward against the headboard, pulling her knees to her chest, frantically yanking a discarded pillow over her torso. The graceful, cinematic illusion of their passionate affair instantly devolved into a pathetic, humiliating scramble of two guilty cowards caught in the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. "Ethan." "Oh my God, Ethan, please," Jessica stuttered, her whole body beginning to shake violently. "Listen to me, wait, please." I didn't say a word, I didn't scream, I didn't charge into the room, and I didn't throw a punch. I am an accountant. When I am faced with a catastrophic error in a ledger, a bankruptcy, or a massive deficit, I do not throw a tantrum. I go cold. I detach. I analyze the raw data in front of me, no matter how profoundly terrible it is. And the data in front of me was absolute. I looked at the stranger. He was frantically pulling on his boxer briefs, his hands shaking so badly he nearly tripped over the plush rug at the foot of the bed. He wouldn't even look me in the eye. He kept his head down, a picture of absolute cowardly shame. He grabbed his dark denim jeans from the floor, the same jeans that had been tangled in my wife's lace underwear just seconds before, and hopped on one foot as he shoved his legs into them. "Get out of my house," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. It wasn't loud, but it was laced with a chilling, absolute authority. It was the voice of a dead man. The stranger didn't need to be told twice. He didn't bother putting his shirt on. He just bunched it up in his fist, grabbed his shoes, and practically sprinted past me. He hugged the doorframe, actively trying to avoid brushing against my shoulder, his head tucked down in a pathetic display of fear. I didn't move an inch to let him pass. I listened to his heavy footsteps bounding down the hardwood stairs, followed by the frantic clatter of him grabbing his leather jacket and keys from the dining room table. Seconds later, the heavy oak front door slammed shut. The loud, aggressive roar of a Merced's engine echoed from the street, followed by the screech of tires as he sped away from the absolute devastation he had helped create. And then, it was just me and my wife. "Ethan," Jessica sobbed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup in dark, jagged streaks. She was still clutching the pillow to her chest, her knuckles white. "Ethan, please, I'm so sorry. It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. Please say something." I stepped into the room. The golden hour sunlight was completely gone now, leaving the master bedroom bathed in a cool, shadowy gray. I walked past the foot of the bed, entirely ignoring her desperate, reaching hand. I walked directly to my closet and pulled open the double doors. I didn't reach for a new suitcase. I simply picked up the heavy leather duffel bag I had just carried in from the airport, the bag that was still packed with my clothes from the San Diego trip. I unzipped it, pulled out the small mesh bag of dirty laundry, and dropped it onto the floor. Then I began methodically pulling clean dress shirts, slacks, and a pair of casual jeans off their hangers, folding them with precise, mechanical movements and placing them into the duffel. "What are you doing?" Jessica cried, her voice escalating into a hysterical, high-pitched wail. She scrambled off the bed, hastily pulling my old college sweatshirt over her head. She ran up behind me, grabbing my arm. "Ethan, stop. You can't just leave. We have to talk about this. You have to let me explain." I stopped folding a shirt. I looked down at her hand, gripping my forearm. The physical contact felt like burning acid against my skin. I slowly turned my head and looked at her. "Explain what, Jessica?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. "Explain the accounting of how many times he's been in my bed while I was sitting in a Marriott in San Diego. Explain how much of the vintage Cabernet you drank before you brought him upstairs." I was lonely. She burst out, the tears flowing freely now. It was the classic, desperate defense of a cornered betrayer. She was immediately trying to shift the ledger, trying to find a way to make my absence the cause of her infidelity. "You are always gone, Ethan. You're always working. You come home exhausted, you barely have any energy left, and I am just sitting in this massive house all by myself." I felt invisible. I stared at her, the sheer, breathtaking audacity of her words hitting me like a physical blow to the chest. I was lonely. You're always working. The rage, which had been perfectly suppressed behind a wall of cold shock, finally cracked the surface. "I was working for you," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper that forced her to step back. "I took every single overtime shift so you could quit that marketing job you hated. I volunteered for the San Diego audits so we could afford the mortgage on this house. I spent thousands of dollars out of my own bonus to build you a custom art studio right down the hall so you could chase your freelance dreams." I pointed a shaking finger toward the bedroom door, gesturing toward the hallway. "I was breaking my back so that we could afford to fill that empty fourth bedroom with a child, so that you could be a stay-at-home mother. I sacrificed my time, my energy, and my presence because I was trying to build a kingdom for you, and you used that time to bring another man into our bed." Jessica crumbled. She sank to her knees right there on the closet floor, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with violent, ugly sobs. She knew there was no argument she could make. There was no justification, no miscommunication, no excuse that could stand against the absolute reality of what she had done. She had taken my devotion, my unwavering financial and emotional support, and she had weaponized it to fund her own affair. I turned my back to her. I zipped the heavy leather duffel bag shut, grabbed the thick canvas handles, and hoisted it over my shoulder. I walked out of the master bedroom without looking back. I walked past the open door of the beautiful, sunlit art studio I had built for her with my own 2 hands. I walked past the empty 4th bedroom that would never see a crib, never hold the laughter of the children I had dreamed of. I descended the 14 hardwood steps I had sanded and stained for her, grabbed my keys from the kitchen island, and stepped into my dress shoes at the front door. "Ethan, please." Jessica screamed from the top of the stairs, her voice echoing through the hollow, silent house. I opened the front door, stepped out into the cool, dark evening air, and pulled the door shut behind me. The heavy brass deadbolt clicked into place with a definitive, final thud. It was the sound of a vault locking permanently. I walked to my car, threw my bag into the passenger seat, and drove away from the only life I had ever wanted, entirely unsure of how I was going to survive the wreckage. Driving away from the Fair Oaks house, I didn't experience the dramatic, cinematic breakdown you see in the movies. I didn't pull over to the side of the highway and pound my fists against the steering wheel, and I didn't scream into the void. Instead, a profound, terrifying numbness washed over me. It felt as though someone had injected Novocaine directly into my veins. The vibrant, colorful future I had spent the last 2 years financing had simply blinked out of existence, leaving behind a cold, sterile vacuum. I merged back onto Interstate 80, the very same highway I had driven down just an hour prior with a heart full of hope. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent the entire drive home lamenting how much I despised corporate hotels, only to navigate my sedan directly toward the downtown Marriott. I walked into the brightly lit lobby, my heavy leather duffel bag slung over my shoulder, and paid for a room using my personal credit card. When I finally closed the door to room 412, the silence of the space was deafening. I sat on the edge of the stiff, perfectly made mattress, staring blankly at the generic landscape painting bolted to the wall. My cell phone, resting on the nightstand, began to vibrate. It vibrated continuously for the next 3 hours. Jessica called 27 times. She left 14 voicemails. She sent a barrage of text messages that ranged from frantic, weeping apologies to angry, defensive accusations, ultimately culminating in desperate pleas for me to just come home so we could work this out. I didn't listen to a single voicemail. I didn't read past the first few words of any text. As an accountant, my entire professional life was dedicated to recognizing when an asset was fundamentally compromised. When a ledger is irreparably unbalanced, when a company is completely bankrupt in its core ethics, you don't pour more capital into it. You cut your losses, you dissolve the partnership, and you liquidate. I picked up the phone, blocked her number, and initiated a hard factory reset on the life I had known. The next morning, I didn't go to marriage counseling. I went to a law firm. I hired a ruthless, highly efficient divorce attorney named Sterling. Sitting in his polished mahogany office looking out over the Sacramento skyline, I laid out the raw data of my marriage with chilling, mechanical detachment. "I want a complete dissolution," I told Sterling, sliding a meticulously organized folder of our shared financials across his desk. "There are no children. The primary asset is the house in Fair Oaks, which has a substantial amount of equity. We have a joint savings account, which I have already frozen. I am the sole income provider. She has been unemployed for 2 years under the guise of starting a freelance business that generates 0 revenue. I want the house sold, the equity split exactly down the middle as per state law, and I want to be completely severed from her legally and financially." Sterling flipped through the folder, raising an eyebrow at the perfect categorization of the documents. "You've made my job incredibly easy, Ethan. Given the circumstances of the infidelity, we can expedite the filing. She'll likely push for spousal support given the income disparity." "Let her try," I replied coldly. "She broke the contract. I am not financing her new life." The following 6 weeks were an agonizing exercise in bureaucratic torture. Because I refused to speak to Jessica directly, all communication was routed through our attorneys. When the reality of the situation finally pierced through her desperate denial, her panic turned into sheer, unadulterated terror. Without my salary to float her lifestyle, Jessica's beautiful, carefree freelance dream violently imploded. The Fair Oaks house was immediately put on the market. I only returned once, accompanied by a police escort to ensure the peace, to pack up the rest of my personal belongings. Walking through the house one last time was like touring a graveyard. I walked past her custom art studio, the expensive digital tablets already packed into cardboard boxes. I walked past the empty fourth bedroom, the door firmly shut. I didn't shed a tear, but the ghost of the family I had wanted so badly felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Because she could not afford the mortgage, and because her art business brought in no money, Jessica was forced to move into a cramped, noisy apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. I heard through mutual friends that she had to swallow her pride and take a grueling, entry-level job doing data entry for an insurance company just to make rent. The man in the Mercedes, the catalyst for this entire disaster, had completely vanished the absolute second the divorce papers were filed. He wanted a fun, secret affair with a lonely housewife. He had zero interest in dealing with a broke, newly single woman whose life was falling apart. She had burned down a kingdom for a fleeting thrill, and now she was sitting entirely alone in the ashes. With the house sold and the divorce finalized, I found myself adrift in a new, unrecognizable reality. I leased a minimalist, slightly sterile apartment in a high-rise downtown, just a 10-minute walk from my accounting firm. The apartment was entirely functional, a place to sleep, shower, and drink coffee. It contained no art, no warm vanilla scents, and no memories. To survive the crushing, hollow void that my marriage had left behind, I turned to the only thing I had left, my work. If I had been a workaholic before the divorce, I became an absolute machine after it. I used spreadsheets, tax codes, and corporate audits as a powerful, numbing anesthetic. 60-hour work weeks quickly bled into 70, and then 80. I was the first person in the office every morning when the sun came up, and I was the last person to leave long after the city streetlights flickered on. I completely isolated myself, declining invitations to grab drinks with my colleagues, choosing instead to bury my trauma under mountains of raw financial data. My boss, a sharp, fiercely demanding managing director named Edith Norton, noticed the drastic shift in my output. Edith was a woman who lived and breathed corporate accounting, and she recognized a kindred spirit in my sudden, obsessive dedication. She began feeding me the most complex, high-stakes accounts the firm had. I took on massive corporate restructuring cases, international tax audits, and highly sensitive merger evaluations. "You're billing more hours than 2 junior partners combined, Ethan," Edith noted one evening, pausing by my cubicle as the rest of the floor emptied out. She looked at me with a mixture of professional approval and subtle maternal concern. "The work is flawless, but you can't live in this office forever. You need to go home." "I don't really have a home to go to anymore, Edith," I replied without looking up from my dual monitors. "I'm fine right here. Send me the files for the Vanguard acquisition. I'll have the risk assessment done by tomorrow morning." I thought I was simply surviving. I thought I was resigning myself to a quiet, solitary life, destined to be the tragic, overworked accountant who had loved a woman too much and lost everything. I fully believed that my story had peaked and permanently flatlined. But as I sat in that quiet, dimly lit office, meticulously crunching numbers and balancing the firm's most lucrative accounts, I was entirely unaware that my relentless, numbing grind was perfectly positioning me for the single greatest financial event in the history of our company. The universe had stripped away my broken foundation, and now it was finally ready to deliver the payoff. There's a profound, almost terrifying clarity that comes when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. When the foundation of your life is completely detonated, the rubble that remains is surprisingly uncomplicated. You no longer have to worry about maintaining a facade. You no longer have to balance the emotional ledgers of a failing marriage. For the first few months after the divorce was finalized, my entire existence was reduced to 3 fundamental things: sleeping in my sterile downtown apartment, drinking copious amounts of black coffee, and dissecting the most complex financial data my firm had to offer. I had turned myself into a corporate machine. It was a trauma response, undoubtedly, but it was highly effective. My managing director, Edith Norton, had, true to her word, handed me the Vanguard acquisition files. Vanguard was a massive, multinational logistics conglomerate that a group of incredibly wealthy private equity clients were preparing to purchase for just over $4 billion. Our accounting firm had been hired to conduct the final, top-to-bottom forensic risk assessment before the ink dried on the contracts. It was a job that typically required a team of 6 senior analysts working for a month. I did it by myself in 3 weeks. It happened on a rainy Thursday night at 2:00 a.m. I was sitting at my desk, the only light on the entire floor radiating from my dual monitors. I was deep inside Vanguard's offshore subsidiary ledgers, cross-referencing their declared physical asset depreciations with their international tax filings. Everything looked perfect. It had been audited by two other massive firms before it even reached my desk, and they had both stamped it with their seal of approval. But as my eyes scanned a series of localized transactions routed through a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, my internal alarm bells began to blare. It was incredibly subtle, the kind of microscopic accounting trickery that only reveals itself when you are staring at the raw data with the obsessive, manic focus of a man who has nothing else to live for. Vanguard's executives had artificially inflated the value of their overseas intellectual property to mask a staggering, catastrophic black hole of corporate debt. They were hiding over $400 million in toxic, unrecoverable liabilities. They weren't just cooking the books. They were actively setting a $4 billion trap for our clients. I didn't sleep for the next 48 hours. I locked myself in my office, surviving entirely on adrenaline and espresso, relentlessly pulling every single thread of that offshore subsidiary. I traced the phantom numbers through dozens of shell companies, compiling the raw data, the timestamps, and the falsified routing numbers. By Monday morning, I had constructed a bulletproof, irrefutable 80-page forensic dossier detailing exactly how the fraud was being executed. At 8:00 a.m., I walked into Edith Norton's corner office, completely bypassing her secretary, and dropped the heavy binder directly onto her mahogany desk. "Cancel the Vanguard merger," I told her, my voice hoarse and raw from lack of sleep. "Right now." Edith looked up from her computer, her brow furrowing in sharp irritation at the intrusion. "Ethan, what are you talking about? The clients are sitting in a boardroom right now preparing to sign the preliminary contracts. We are set to clear a massive consulting fee today. If they sign those contracts, Edith, they are buying a $400 million anchor that will sink their entire portfolio within 2 years," I replied evenly. I tapped the binder with my index finger. "Vanguard is completely fraudulent. The data is all right there. I tracked every single penny." Edith's irritation instantly vanished, replaced by the razor-sharp focus that had made her a legend in the financial district. She opened the binder. For the next 30 minutes, the only sound in the office was the crisp turning of pages and the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. When she finally reached the end of my executive summary, the color had completely drained from her face. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute horror and profound, staggering awe. "My God, Ethan," she whispered. 3 separate auditing firms missed this. The SEC missed this. How did you catch it?" "I had nothing better to do this weekend," I replied flatly. What happened next was a corporate earthquake of epic proportions. Edith stormed into the boardroom and halted the acquisition just minutes before the contracts were signed. When she presented my forensic dossier to our private equity clients, the room erupted into chaos. Not only did our clients pull out of the deal, but they immediately weaponized the data I had uncovered, leveraging it to short Vanguard stock and file a massive, multi-million-dollar fraud lawsuit against the conglomerate's board of directors. Because our firm had saved them from a $4 billion disaster, our clients didn't just pay us our standard consulting fee. They activated a highly obscure, incredibly lucrative contingency clause in our contract designed to reward forensic auditors for identifying critical, catastrophic liabilities. 2 weeks later, the dust had finally settled. Vanguard's stock was in a freefall, their executives were under federal investigation, and our accounting firm had just experienced the single most profitable quarter in its history. I was sitting in my cubicle, mindlessly formatting a standard tax return when Edith's secretary tapped me on the shoulder. "She wants to see you," the secretary said with a knowing smile. I walked into Edith's corner office and sat in one of the plush leather chairs opposite her desk. She wasn't wearing her usual stern, corporate scowl. She was beaming. She reached into her desk drawer, pulled out a thick, sealed ivory envelope, and slid it across the mahogany surface toward me. "What's this?" I asked, looking down at it. "That, Ethan, is the manifestation of the board's gratitude," Edith said smoothly, leaning back in her chair. "When you saved the Vanguard deal, you triggered a liability recovery contingency fee from our clients. It was a massive payout for the firm. But I went to the partners and I made it abundantly clear that the firm didn't find the fraud. You found the fraud, by yourself, at 2 in the morning on a Thursday." I picked up the envelope. It felt surprisingly heavy. I broke the wax seal, opened the flap, and pulled out the single sheet of embossed corporate stationery inside. It was an official notice of a direct wire transfer into my personal checking account. I scanned the legal jargon, my eyes immediately dropping to the bolded number at the bottom of the page. $6,500,000. I stopped breathing. The numbers on the page seemed to blur and swim before my eyes. $6.5 million. It was an astronomical, completely incomprehensible sum of money. Even after federal and state taxes took their massive, unavoidable slice, I would be left with more liquid wealth than I could have ever earned in a lifetime of grinding out standard 60-hour work weeks. "The funds cleared this morning," Edith said softly, watching my absolute shock with quiet satisfaction. "You don't just work here anymore, Ethan. As of today, you have your pick of any senior partnership track you want, but more importantly, you can finally go home and rest." I walked out of the office in a complete daze. I don't remember the elevator ride down to the lobby, and I barely remember the walk back to my minimalist apartment. When I finally unlocked my door and stepped inside, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and opened my banking app. The loading wheel spun for 3 agonizing seconds, and then the screen refreshed. The balance was real. The money was sitting there, a towering, magnificent mountain of digital wealth. I sat down heavily on my cheap, uncomfortable sofa and let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. The sheer, devastating irony of the universe hit me with the force of a freight train. Jessica had destroyed our marriage, shattered my heart, and blown up our future because she claimed my work schedule made her feel invisible. She had cheated on me in our own bed because she didn't want to wait for the payoff of my sacrifices. If she had remained faithful, if she had just held on for 2 more months, she would have had absolutely everything she ever dreamed of. She could have funded her art studio indefinitely. We could have bought a larger house, traveled the world, and started a family without a single financial worry. Her impatience and her betrayal hadn't just cost her a husband, it had cost her a multi-million-dollar empire. And because the divorce was completely finalized, because my legal and financial ties to her had been aggressively and permanently severed by my attorney 6 weeks ago, she wasn't entitled to a single, solitary cent of this windfall. I was rich. I was completely, undeniably wealthy. But as I sat in the echoing silence of my dark apartment, staring at the breathtaking number on my phone's screen, I realized something profoundly important. Money is a spectacular tool, but it is a terrible bandage. $6.5 million could buy me a fleet of sports cars, a sprawling mansion, or a permanent vacation, but it couldn't instantly repair the deep, lingering trauma of a broken heart. I didn't immediately go out and celebrate. I didn't buy a Rolex, and I didn't upgrade my apartment. I made a quiet, definitive decision right then and there. I was going to keep my wealth a complete, absolute secret. The money was my invisible shield. It was the ultimate freedom. The freedom to heal on my own terms, the freedom to breathe without the suffocating weight of financial panic, and the freedom to finally rediscover who Ethan was outside of a spreadsheet. The universe had ruthlessly cleared the board, and then it had handed me a golden ticket. Now, I just had to figure out how to live again. For the first 3 months after the $6.5 million wire transfer cleared, my life was an absolute paradox. I was sitting on a mountain of liquid wealth that could rival the GDP of a small island nation, yet I was living with the exact same disciplined, monastic routine as a first-year college student. I didn't upgrade my minimalist downtown apartment. I didn't trade in my reliable, slightly dented sedan for a Porsche, and I certainly didn't start buying designer suits. In fact, the only luxury I allowed myself was the absolute, unadulterated freedom of time. I took an extended, indefinite leave of absence from the accounting firm. Edith Norton had told me I could have any partnership track I wanted, but the truth was, the intense, 80-hour work weeks had served their purpose. They had successfully carried me through the darkest, most agonizing chapter of my divorce, but I no longer needed the spreadsheets to numb the pain. The deep, lingering trauma of Jessica's betrayal was finally beginning to soften, leaving behind a quiet, expansive peace. I was ready to re-enter the world, but I was determined to do it entirely under the radar. My newfound wealth was my invisible armor. I knew that if I flaunted it, I would instantly attract the exact type of opportunistic, surface-level people that had already cost me years of my life. I needed to know that whoever I brought into my new chapter would love Ethan the boring, pragmatic accountant, not Ethan the multimillionaire. My rebirth began on a crisp, overcast Tuesday morning in late November. I had developed a habit of taking long, aimless walks through the city to clear my head. On this particular morning, a sudden heavy downpour forced me to seek refuge inside a bustling, independent coffee shop called the Roasted Bean. It was a chaotic, charmingly cluttered space, filled with the rich aroma of grinding espresso beans, damp wool coats, and old books. The shop was absolutely packed. Every leather armchair and window stool was occupied by college students with headphones or remote workers intensely staring at glowing screens. I ordered a simple black drip coffee and managed to snag the very last available seat in the house. A small, wobbly wooden chair tucked into the far back corner at a tiny, square table. I sat down, pulled a paperback thriller from my jacket pocket, and took a sip of my coffee. For 10 minutes, I existed in perfect, uninterrupted solitude. And then the universe decided it was time to introduce me to Maya. "Excuse me," a voice said, breaking through the low hum of the cafe's background noise. "I am so incredibly sorry to bother you, but my laptop is currently at 1% battery. The only available outlet in this entire zip code is directly beneath your chair, and I'm about 3 minutes away from a massive professional crisis. Can I please share your table?" I looked up. Standing in front of me was a woman who radiated an entirely different kind of energy than anyone I had ever met. She had wild, dark, curly hair pulled back into a messy clip, and she was balancing a massive canvas tote bag, a glowing silver laptop, an oversized travel mug, and a half-eaten blueberry muffin with the frantic precision of a circus juggler. She wasn't wearing an inch of makeup. She was dressed in a comfortable, oversized sweater and faded jeans, and her dark eyes were wide with genuine, unapologetic panic. She wasn't trying to be elegant. She wasn't trying to project a flawless, curated image. She was just entirely, wonderfully human. "Of course," I said, immediately sliding my book aside and gesturing to the empty wooden chair across from me. "The outlet is right down there by the table leg. Please save your crisis." "You are an absolute lifesaver. A true hero of the modern age," she breathed, dropping into the chair and practically diving under the table to jam her charger into the wall socket. She popped back up, her laptop screen miraculously springing back to life, and let out a massive, dramatic sigh of relief. "I owe you my firstborn child, or at the very least, my next cup of coffee." "I'll settle for the coffee," I smiled, genuinely amused. "I'm Ethan." "Maya," she replied, offering a quick, warm smile before her eyes darted back to her screen. Her fingers instantly began flying across the keyboard at lightning speed. "And please excuse me for the next 5 minutes, Ethan. I just have to put out a digital fire." For the next 10 minutes, I quietly read my book while I watched Maya work. It was fascinating. She wasn't just typing, she was commanding a battlefield. Her cell phone rang twice. She answered it, balancing the phone between her ear and her shoulder, and navigated the conversations with a sharp, witty, and fiercely authoritative tone. "No, David, we are not posting that graphic," she said into the phone at one point, rolling her eyes so hard I thought she might lose her balance. "Because the algorithm doesn't care about your aesthetic vision, David. It cares about engagement, and that graphic looks like it was designed in 1998. Trust me, I'll send the new copy in 3 minutes. Bye." She hung up, slammed her laptop shut, and leaned back in her chair, blowing a stray curl out of her face. She looked across the table at me and grimaced apologetically. "I am so sorry," she sighed. "I manage social media branding for clients who have entirely too much money and zero self-awareness. It's like babysitting adults who throw tantrums on the internet." I let out a loud, genuine laugh, the first real, unburdened laugh I had experienced in almost a year. "It sounds exhausting, but you seem to handle it incredibly well." "I survive on caffeine and spite," she joked, taking a long sip from her travel mug. "What about you, Ethan? You don't look like a guy who argues with influencers for a living. You look much too calm." "I'm a corporate accountant," I told her, bracing myself for the usual glazed-over look people get when I mention my profession. Instead, Maya's eyes lit up with genuine appreciation. "An accountant? Oh, thank God. So you're the guy who actually knows how the real world works while the rest of us just pretend on the internet. That's a superpower. I respect it." That simple, authentic interaction was the spark that ignited the rest of my life. We sat in that crowded, noisy coffee shop for another 3 hours. My black coffee went completely cold, and her laptop battery drained back down to 0, but neither of us cared. We talked about everything and nothing. I learned that she was fiercely independent, entirely self-made, and had a remarkably grounded perspective on the world. She didn't care about luxury brands or keeping up appearances. She cared about authenticity, honesty, and hard work. Over the next few months, that serendipitous coffee shop meeting blossomed into the most beautiful, effortless relationship I had ever experienced. Dating Maya was a breath of fresh air that actively healed my wounded soul. I kept my massive financial secret completely hidden. I picked her up for dates in my dented sedan. We didn't go to five-star Michelin restaurants. We ate tacos from local food trucks, we took long walks through the botanical gardens, and we spent countless weekend evenings sitting on the floor of my minimalist apartment, eating cheap takeout and watching old movies. Unlike Jessica, who had always expected me to foot the bill and carry the financial weight of her lifestyle, Maya was fiercely insistent on equality. If I bought the movie tickets, she bought the popcorn. If I paid for dinner on Friday, she would physically wrestle the check out of my hand on Saturday. "I've got it, numbers guy," she would say, tapping her credit card against the table with a playful smirk. "I work hard for my money and I like treating you." Every time she did that, my heart swelled with an overwhelming, profound sense of gratitude. She wasn't looking for a savior, and she certainly wasn't looking for a bank. She was just looking for a partner. She loved me simply because I was Ethan. She loved my dry sense of humor, she loved my quiet consistency, and she loved the way I listened to her complain about her demanding clients. By the time the winter snow melted and the early signs of spring began to bloom across the city, I knew without a single doubt in my mind that I was entirely, hopelessly in love with her. She had unknowingly pieced my shattered heart back together just by being her authentic, wonderful self. But as my love for Maya deepened, so did my desire to completely close the book on the city that held so many ghosts of my past. I didn't want to run into Edith Norton at a grocery store, and I certainly didn't want to risk ever crossing paths with Jessica or her family. I wanted a totally blank canvas. I wanted to start a brand new life in a brand new place, and I wanted Maya right there by my side. We were sitting on the couch in my apartment on a lazy Sunday afternoon when I finally broached the subject. "Maya," I said, turning to look at her as she scrolled through a social media feed on her phone. "How attached are you to this city?" She paused, lowering her phone, her dark eyes searching my face. "I mean, it's fine. My clients are all remote, so I can work from literally anywhere with a Wi-Fi connection. Why do you ask?" "Because I want to leave," I told her honestly. "I want to pack up the car, drive up the Pacific Coast Highway and see where we end up. Maybe Seattle, maybe somewhere even further north. I want a fresh start, and I want to do it with you." Maya didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for a 5-year plan, and she didn't ask for a spreadsheet. She just smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners with that beautiful, fearless energy I loved so much. "A road trip up the coast?" she asked softly. "Just the two of us." "Just the two of us," I confirmed. "Okay," she nodded, reaching out to take my hand. "Let's go." There is a distinct, almost intoxicating physical sensation that accompanies the act of leaving a life behind. It isn't just an emotional shift. You can actually feel it in the air pressure of the car cabin, in the vibration of the steering wheel, and in the rhythm of your own heartbeat. We packed my reliable, slightly dented sedan on a crisp, foggy Friday morning. I didn't have much to bring. When you've liquidated a marriage and spent a year living like a corporate monk in a sterile downtown high-rise, your physical footprint becomes remarkably small. 2 duffel bags of clothes, a box of essential paperwork, and a small crate of books were all I possessed. Maya, true to her chaotic, vibrant nature, brought a little more. She emerged from her apartment building lugging 3 massive canvas tote bags overflowing with sweaters, 2 different camera bags, a small forest of potted succulents she absolutely refused to abandon, and of course, her glowing silver laptop. "I know it looks like I'm packing for a localized apocalypse," she laughed, wrestling a particularly stubborn aloe vera plant into the backseat. "But I promise, this is the absolute bare minimum a social media manager needs to survive in the wild." "I wouldn't have it any other way," I smiled, closing the trunk with a definitive, satisfying thud. I slid into the driver's seat, put the car in gear, and merged onto the highway. Watching the Sacramento skyline shrink and eventually disappear in my rearview mirror was the most profound exhale of my entire life. The ghosts of the Fair Oaks house, the suffocating memory of Jessica's betrayal, and the sterile, fluorescent nightmares of the corporate accounting firm all dissolved into the morning. I was a completely free man, sitting next to a woman who loved me for exactly who I was, driving toward a totally blank canvas. Our route was ambitious, scenic, and entirely unhurried. We bypassed the fast, highly efficient interstates in favor of the Pacific Coast Highway. Highway 1 is not a road you take when you are in a rush. It is a winding, serpentine ribbon of asphalt carved directly into the sheer cliffs of the California coastline, demanding your absolute attention and rewarding you with the most breathtaking, aggressively beautiful landscapes on the planet. For the first 3 days, The drive was pure magic. Maya appointed herself as the official expedition DJ and chief navigator. She curated highly specific playlists for every shift in the scenery. We listened to upbeat, driving indie rock as we navigated the sun-drenched, perilous curves of Big Sur, the deep, sapphire blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean crashing violently against the jagged rocks hundreds of feet below us. We switched to moody, atmospheric folk music as we crossed the Golden Gate Bridge and pushed further north into the dense, misty canopy of the Redwood National Forest. Even on a road trip, Maya's work didn't completely stop. She was a professional, entirely self-made, and she took her clients seriously. But instead of letting it stress her out, she seamlessly integrated it into the journey. I would drive, the windows rolled down to let in the sharp, salty sea air, while Maya sat in the passenger seat, her laptop tethered to her phone's cellular hotspot. I loved listening to her work. I would casually glance over and watch her fingers fly across the keyboard, completely in her element. "Okay, Ethan, settle a debate for me," she said one afternoon, looking up from her screen as we cruised through a sleepy coastal town in Mendocino County. "If you are a luxury skincare brand, and you are trying to apologize for accidentally shipping empty jars to 50 influencers, do you issue a notes app apology on Twitter? Or do you film a highly produced, tearful TikTok video?" "As an accountant," I replied, keeping my eyes on the winding road, "I would suggest you issue a full financial refund and fire the logistics coordinator." Maya burst out laughing, slapping her laptop shut. "See, this is why I keep you around. You cut right through the digital nonsense. Financial refund it is. I'll tell the CEO to open his wallet." Because I was still fiercely guarding the secret of my multi-million-dollar wealth, our travel budget was entirely dictated by the illusion of my modest savings. We didn't stay in five-star coastal resorts with infinity pools and private sommeliers. We stayed in cheap, quirky, slightly run-down roadside motels with buzzing neon vacancy signs. We ate heavily battered fish and chips from small, family-owned crab shacks on the side of the road, and we drank terrible, watered-down coffee from all-night diners. And Maya didn't complain a single time. In fact, she reveled in it. One night in Eureka, our motel room turned out to have a heater that sounded like a dying lawnmower and a mattress so lumpy it defied the laws of physics. Jessica would have thrown an absolute scorched earth tantrum. She would have demanded I call the front desk, secure a refund, and drive 3 hours to find a luxury suite. But Maya just threw her heavy canvas weekender bag onto the floor, bounced onto the terrible bed, and laughed. "Well, it's not the Ritz," she smiled, pulling a thick wool blanket up to her chin. "But the neon sign outside is flashing pink through the blinds, and it feels like we're in a retro noir film. It's romantic. Come here." I lay down next to her in that cheap, drafty motel room, listening to the rain begin to patter against the thin glass window, and I felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly knocked the breath out of my lungs. This was the ultimate, irrefutable proof. She wasn't an opportunist. She wasn't a parasite looking for a host to fund her lavish lifestyle. She was a genuine, fiercely loyal partner who found joy in the simple, unpolished reality of just being together. As we crossed the border into Oregon, the landscape shifted. The sunny, golden cliffs of California gave way to rugged, pine-covered shorelines and dramatic, gray skies. The air grew colder, but the atmosphere inside the car only grew warmer. We spent hours talking about everything we wanted our new life in Seattle to be. We talked about finding a small apartment near the Pike Place Market, about navigating the famous Pacific Northwest rain, and about the thrill of building a community from scratch. "I'm going to have to hustle when we get there," Maya mused one afternoon, staring out the window at the towering Oregon pines. "I have my remote clients, but I really want to pitch to some of the local tech startups in the city, build a local roster. What about you, Ethan? Are you going to look for another massive accounting firm, or try to find a smaller boutique agency?" I gripped the steering wheel, a sudden heavy knot of guilt settling in the pit of my stomach. In my pocket, safely locked behind facial recognition software and a complex passcode on my banking app, was $6.5 million. I had enough liquid capital to buy a penthouse overlooking the Puget Sound in cash tomorrow morning. I had enough wealth that neither of us ever had to hustle for a difficult client or sit through a grueling corporate interview ever again. I was making the woman I loved sleep on lumpy motel mattresses and worry about her freelance roster to preserve a secret that had already served its purpose. My invisible armor had done its job. It had protected me from gold diggers and allowed me to find a woman who loved my soul, not my bank account. But holding on to the secret now felt less like protection and more like deception. I think, I said slowly, choosing my words with absolute terrifying care, I might take a little break from corporate accounting for a while. Maya turned her head, raising a curious eyebrow. A break? Ethan, that's incredibly out of character for you. Are you sure? Seattle is an expensive city. We have enough in our savings to float us for a few months, but we can't just live on scenic road trip vibes forever. I looked over at her. Her dark eyes were filled with nothing but genuine, practical concern for our shared future. She was ready to shoulder the financial burden, ready to grind out the hours to make sure we didn't sink. She was the absolute antithesis of my ex-wife. Maya, I said, my voice barely louder than the hum of the sedan's tires on the wet asphalt. There's something I need to tell you. The interior of the sedan fell so incredibly silent that the rhythmic, steady thwack, thwack, thwack of the windshield wipers suddenly sounded like a metronome counting down to an explosion. Maya reached out and twisted the volume dial on the radio until the atmospheric folk music faded away completely. She shifted in the passenger seat, pulling her knees up slightly and turning her entire body to face me. The playful, unbothered energy she had carried for the last 500 miles completely evaporated, replaced by a sharp, highly attuned focus. Okay, she said, her voice steady but laced with a sudden, palpable caution. You're using the serious voice, the accountant delivering bad news voice. What is it, Ethan? Are you having second thoughts about Seattle, about us? No, I answered immediately, the word leaving my mouth with absolute, desperate certainty. God, no, Maya, never about us. Moving to Seattle with you is the only thing in my life that makes perfect, undeniable sense right now. I kept my eyes fixed on the wet asphalt of the coastal highway, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were turning white. The towering, mist-shrouded Oregon pines blurred past the windows in a streak of dark green. Then what is it? She asked softly, reaching across the center console to rest her hand gently over my white-knuckled grip on the wheel. You can tell me anything, you know that. I know, I exhaled, feeling the warmth of her palm against my skin. It's about what you said a minute ago. About hustling for clients and grinding out the hours when we get to the city so we don't sink. You don't have to do that, Maya. You don't have to take on clients that disrespect you, and you don't have to stress about making rent while we get settled. Maya offered a small, confused smile, her thumb tracing the back of my hand. Ethan, it's sweet that you want to protect me, but we've talked about this. I know you have a decent savings account, but living in a major city burns through cash fast. We are going to have to work. No, I said, finally tearing my eyes away from the road for a fraction of a second to look at her. We really don't. Maya, I haven't been entirely honest with you about my financial situation. The confused smile slowly faded from her face. She withdrew her hand, settling back into her seat. As an independent, self-made woman who managed her own life, the concept of hidden financial realities was an automatic red flag. I could practically see her mind racing, immediately jumping to the most logical, terrifying conclusions. Ethan, please tell me you aren't running from the IRS, she said, her voice dropping an octave. Please tell me you don't have a secret mountain of gambling debt or some massive, catastrophic liability from your divorce that you're hiding from me. If we're going to build a life together, I need the actual balance sheet. It's the exact opposite, I said, a dry, nervous laugh escaping my chest. It's the exact opposite of debt. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs with the sharp scent of the rain and the pine trees outside. I needed her to understand the context before I dropped the number. I needed her to understand the trauma that had forced me to build the invisible armor in the first place. When I caught Jessica in our house, I began, my voice thick with the painful, lingering ghosts of the past. It didn't just break my heart, it completely destroyed my understanding of trust. I had spent 2 years paying for her entire life, building her a studio, sacrificing my own happiness so she could be comfortable. And she used that comfort to betray me. When the divorce was finalized, I was so profoundly hollowed out that I turned myself into a machine. I worked 80-hour weeks at the firm because staring at spreadsheets was the only thing that kept me from losing my mind. Maya's expression softened instantly. She had known the broad strokes of my divorce, but I had rarely spoken about the raw, visceral mechanics of how it had broken me. She listened quietly, her dark eyes entirely focused on my face. Right before I met you, I continued, navigating a long, sweeping curve in the highway, My firm put me on a massive $4 billion corporate acquisition audit. I found a deliberate, incredibly well-hidden $400 million fraud in the offshore ledgers. I caught it at 2 in the morning, and I brought it to my managing director. We killed the merger, saved our private equity clients from buying a catastrophic liability, and completely exposed the fraud. Ethan, that's incredible, Maya said, her eyes widening slightly. That's front-page financial news stuff. It was, I nodded. But what I never told you is that by exposing the fraud, our firm triggered a highly obscure liability recovery contingency clause with our clients. It resulted in the largest single payout the firm had ever seen in its history. And because my managing director is an incredibly ethical, cutthroat woman who knew I found the error entirely on my own. I swallowed hard. The words felt heavy on my tongue. She ensured that the firm cut me a direct, personal check for my forensic work. Maya was silent for a long moment. Okay, she said slowly, clearly trying to mentally calculate what a massive corporate bonus looked like. So, what are we talking about? Like $50,000, $100,000. Ethan, if you have $100,000 sitting in the bank, that's amazing, but it's not retire in Seattle money. I signaled, pulled the sedan onto a wide, gravel shoulder overlooking the dramatic, crashing waves of the Pacific coastline and put the car in park. I unbuckled my seatbelt and turned to face her entirely. Maya, I said quietly, looking directly into her beautiful, wide eyes. The wire transfer they sent me was for $6.5 million. The only sound in the car was the aggressive, rhythmic beating of the rain against the roof. Maya just stared at me. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. For a terrifying, agonizing 10 seconds, she looked like a wax statue perfectly frozen in a state of absolute, uncomprehending shock. What? She finally whispered. The word barely had any sound behind it. I mean, obviously, the federal and state governments took an absolute massive chunk of it. I rambled, my accountant brain instinctively trying to clarify the exact margins to fill the terrifying silence. Uncle Sam never misses a payday. So after the capital gains and income taxes, the actual liquid cash resting in the account is closer to about 3 point. Ethan, Maya practically shouted, holding both her hands up in the air to stop my frantic rambling. Stop, just stop doing math for a second. She pressed her hands against her face, rubbing her temples, letting out a wild, breathless sound that was halfway between a laugh and a gasp. She dropped her hands and stared at me, her eyes tracking every single micro-expression on my face to see if this was some elaborate, cruel joke. You are a millionaire, she asked, pronouncing every single syllable with slow, deliberate precision. You are sitting here in a 2018 sedan with a dent in the rear bumper, wearing a flannel shirt you bought at Target, telling me that you have millions of dollars sitting in a checking account. Yes, I nodded, and you never told me. I wanted to, I pleaded, reaching out to take her hands again. This time, she let me hold them, though her fingers were completely rigid. Maya, you have to understand. When that money cleared, I was terrified. Jessica had just spent years treating me like an ATM machine. The moment I became wealthy, I knew that if anyone found out, I would never know if they were looking at me or if they were looking at the bank account. I needed to be invisible. I needed to know that someone could love Ethan, the boring, traumatized accountant. I squeezed her hands, leaning closer. Then I met you. You fought me for every dinner check. You split the movie tickets. You never once asked me for anything other than my time and my honesty. You slept on a lumpy mattress in Eureka that sounded like a lawnmower and you laughed about it. You loved me for me. My invisible armor did exactly what it was supposed to do. It helped me find you. But I can't start a new life in Seattle keeping this from you. It feels like a lie, and you don't deserve lies. Maya stared at me, the shock slowly, beautifully melting away, replaced by an expression of profound, deeply moved understanding. She looked at my terrified face, and then she let out a loud, genuine, roaring laugh. She pulled one of her hands free and playfully slapped me hard on the shoulder. You absolute idiot. She laughed, shaking her head in total disbelief. I ate lukewarm gas station hot dogs with you in Crescent City. I thought we were on a strict budget. I've been silently calculating the cost of our gasoline for the last 3 days. I'm sorry, I laughed back, a massive, crushing weight finally lifting off my chest. I promise no more gas station hot dogs. We can buy the whole gas station if you want. I don't want a gas station, Ethan, she smiled, her eyes softening as she reached up to cup my cheek. Her thumb brushed gently against my jawline. And I don't care about the money, seriously. It's incredible and it's life-changing, and I am so unbelievably proud of you for exposing those corporate crooks. But I didn't fall in love with a bank account in that coffee shop. I fell in love with a man who gave up his only chair so a frantic girl could charge her laptop. She leaned across the center console and kissed me, a deep, grounding, wildly passionate kiss that tasted like coffee and absolute freedom. "But just for the record," she whispered against my lips, pulling back slightly with a wicked, teasing smirk. "When we get to Seattle, we are staying in a 5-star hotel with incredibly high water pressure and room service. The road trip motel era of this relationship has officially concluded." "Whatever you want, Maya," I grinned, pulling her back in for another kiss. "Whatever you want." I put the sedan back in drive and pulled out onto the highway. As we crossed the state line into Washington, the dense rain finally broke, giving way to a spectacular, clear afternoon sky. For the first time in my life, I wasn't driving toward an obligation, a corporate audit, or a broken home. I was driving toward a horizon that was entirely, infinitely ours, equipped with everything we would ever need to build the perfect life. The rest of the drive up to Seattle felt less like a road trip and more like a victory lap. True to her word, the absolute second we crossed the city limits, Maya expertly navigated us away from the budget motels and directed me straight toward a towering, 5-star luxury hotel downtown. We booked a penthouse suite overlooking the glittering waters of the Puget Sound, ordered an embarrassing amount of overpriced room service, and spent the entire weekend wrapped in plush, ridiculously high thread count robes, laughing at the sheer absurdity of our new reality. But even with millions of dollars at our disposal, the core of who we were didn't change. Money didn't turn Maya into a different person. It simply amplified the wonderful, fiercely independent woman she already was. We didn't buy a mega mansion. Instead, we found a beautiful, historic craftsman-style home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood just outside the city center. I paid for it in cash. The day we received the keys, we sat on the empty living room floor eating takeout pizza, exactly the way we had in my tiny, sterile apartment back in California. Only this time, there were no ghosts haunting the walls. With the crushing weight of financial survival entirely removed, Maya's career absolutely exploded. Without the pressure of needing to take on toxic clients just to make rent, she dropped the people who disrespected her and focused entirely on local, ethical startups she actually believed in. She worked just as hard as she always had, but she worked with joy. As for me, I realized that I couldn't completely walk away from the numbers game. It was just how my brain was wired. But I refused to ever step foot in a corporate pressure cooker again. I opened a small, boutique financial consulting firm on my own terms. I took on 3 clients a year, set my own hours, and spent the rest of my time hiking the Pacific Northwest trails with Maya and our newly adopted golden retriever. Every now and then, usually when the Seattle rain is tapping gently against our window, and the house is filled with the smell of Maya's coffee and the sound of her typing, I think back to that terrible Tuesday afternoon in Fair Oaks. I heard through the grapevine of old mutual acquaintances that karma had eventually caught up with Jessica in full force. The stress of her dead-end data entry job and the reality of her self-inflicted poverty had completely hardened her. She had tried to reach out to a few of my old colleagues to see if I would be willing to help her out, financially, completely unaware that I had left the state and vanished into a tax bracket she couldn't even comprehend. She had thrown away a kingdom because she lacked the patience and loyalty to help build it. I used to look back at my broken garage door as the worst stroke of luck a man could have. Now, I realize it was the greatest gift the universe could have ever given me. It forced me to see the truth. It forced me to walk through the fire so that I could emerge on the other side, completely unburdened, and find the woman who actually deserved the world I was trying to build. Light bulb, a valuable lesson for the listener. If there is one profound takeaway from Ethan's incredible journey, it is this. Sometimes the universe has to violently tear down your current life to make room for the life you actually deserve. When we experience a devastating betrayal, whether it's from a partner, a friend, or a family member, it is incredibly easy to internalize that pain. We often ask ourselves, what did I do wrong? Was my love not enough? Did I not sacrifice enough? Ethan gave his wife everything. He financed her dreams, worked grueling hours, and built her a sanctuary, only to be rewarded with the ultimate disrespect. But her betrayal was never a reflection of Ethan's worth. It was a reflection of her own broken character. The lesson here is about the true definition of partnership. A real partner does not view you as a utility, an ATM, or a stepping stone to their own comfort. A real partner like Maya is willing to sit with you in the cramped, uncomfortable moments of life and share the burden. They love you for your character, your consistency, and your heart, not the balance of your checking account. If you are currently sitting in the ashes of a relationship or a situation that has fallen apart, do not let it permanently harden you. Do not assume that your story has peaked. Liquidate the toxic connections, cut your losses, and protect your peace. You never know what incredible windfall, whether it be financial, emotional, or romantic, is waiting for you just around the corner, ready to completely rewrite your happily ever after. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. Have you ever experienced a devastating moment that actually turned out to be the greatest blessing of your life? How did you rebuild after a major betrayal? Let me know your thoughts and stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed Ethan's journey of ultimate karma, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story. Until next time, know your worth, protect your peace, and take care of yourselves.